very narrowly decided. So it's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you all here today on Constitution Day. You have a real treat. I have had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Tom Lindsay since my arrival in Texas in late 2011. Dr. Lindsay received his Ph.D. in political philosophy, and while a fair amount of that was the study of the ancients like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, a significant portion of that Ph.D. in political science was the study of the U.S. Constitution and its origins, how it came together and its practical application in the United States. And what's really fun about that is that fundamental understanding is actually in sync with what happened in history. There's no modern revisionist patina on top of that. So I don't know what that makes you, whether that's kind of like a throwback or Back to the Future or something. I'm not quite sure, but I know I really appreciate it because I certainly think that the understanding of the Constitution and how it's applied is very underappreciated today. For example, you see a lot of talk about why do we have the Electoral College anyway? Indeed, why? Why do we have that Electoral College? Well, there's some pretty sound reasons, beginning with the fact that we are foremost a republic, a rule of law, a republic, representative democracy. Quite a bit different than the city-states of ancient Greece and the pure democracy that they practiced. So with that, I think you're in for a real treat. There will be Q&A after. And I would be remiss in reminding all of you that if you do not yet have your own pocket Constitution and Declaration of Independence, there will be an ample supply outside in the lobby at the completion of this event, and that'll help you to properly respond to the pop quiz that you'll be receiving as you leave. You can't leave until you answer the questions correctly for the pop quiz. So we'll see how well all of you do. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce and bring up Dr. Tom Lindsay.
Thank you, Chuck, for that kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Happy Constitution Day. I've got a lot of information, some of it alarming, to tell you about today, but let me start with a story, a true story, about what happened to me in June when we launched our TPPF Summer Institute for high school civics teachers. It was a wonderful experience for me, but I learned something there that has changed how I think about this whole question before us today of civic education. One of the teachers told us that by the time students are middle school age, they come to class already cynical about the American regime at middle school age, right? The rest of the teachers all said, that's right, and it's getting worse every year, right? Now, although this problem is, I think, unparalleled in our history, it's not a new problem. To see this, let me tell you another story, also a true story. At the tender age of 29, an Illinois politician gave a speech that speaks very much to the concerns that have brought us together today. He was alarmed by the fact that, in his view, reverence for the Constitution and for the rule of law in general was declining in America. Replacing the rule of law, he feared, was what he called the mobocratic spirit. Mobocratic, meaning ruled by the passions of the mob, right? Well, of course, his name was Abraham Lincoln, and the speech that he gave was in 1838. 167 years later, in 2005, President George W. Bush echoed Lincoln's concern when he established September 17th as a national holiday, right? A day of national celebration because, as Chuck mentioned, that was the day that the delegates to the Constitution in Philadelphia signed the Constitution. Today, 14 years later, what is the state of civic education in America? To begin to answer this question, I'll ask you a question. American government's divided into three branches. Can you name all three? I know you can, right? Right? I know you can. In this room, you're the majority. The bad news is, in this country, you're the minority, right? National polling finds that only 26% of Americans can name all three branches of government, right? And this is down from 38% in 2011. So this is not a blip. This is a steady decline. Worse, 33% of Americans today cannot even name one branch of government, right? Only 37% of Americans can name even one of the rights protected in the First Amendment, right? Only 1 in 3. Now, as bad as this is, there's something worse. There's something worse than not knowing the facts about your country. What's worse? Things that you think you know are facts about your country but are false, right? Now, from where do these false accounts of America come? That's the purpose of my address today, right? I will take you through 3 recent articles, 2 from the New York Times, 1 from Vox, all of which argue that, in fact, we should not be celebrating either Constitution Day or July 4th. Beginning with the New York Times, this summer, the Times began what it calls the 1619 Project, right? Which advertises that it, quote, aims to reframe America's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, unquote. Why 1619? Because, says the Times, that's the date of the arrival of the first slaves to the land that would, 150 years later, be named the United States. In other words, for the New York Times and the 1619 Project, America's true founding, its true uniqueness, is tied to slavery. Now, I wish this example were just an outlier, right? But I first learned a couple of years ago of a growing misconception about slavery in this country. I learned about this about 3 years ago when I read an article that a professor published in which he said that for the last 11 years, he had been quizzing his students at the beginning of each semester to find out what they knew about American history. By far, the most shocking result that came from his years of polling was this. Students overwhelmingly believe, quote, that slavery was an American problem, and they are very fuzzy about the history of slavery prior to the colonial era. Their entire education about slavery was confined to America, unquote. Now, of course, as we all know, it is absolutely indispensable to study the history of slavery in this country. But what if America wasn't unique in holding slaves, right? What if America didn't invent slavery, as our students have come to think? Right? In our just Google it era, even if their teachers won't provide them the information, students can go online and find out that, in fact, slavery dates back over 9,000 years to Mesopotamia, 6,800 BC, right? Right? If they read their Bibles, they'll know that in 1700 BC, they read the book of Exodus, that the people of Israel were held in slavery under Pharaoh. Okay? By the 8th century AD, African slaves were being sold to Arab households in a Muslim world that at the time spanned from Spain to Persia. Right? By the year 1000 AD, the number of slaves captured in Germany grew so large that their nationality became the generic term for slaves, Slavs, right? Slavs, right? But in this country, the antipathy of many Americans towards slavery became evident as early as 1775 when Quakers in Pennsylvania established the first abolitionist society. And oh, by the way, Betsy Ross, whose flag was deemed politically incorrect by Nike, she was herself both a Quaker and an abolitionist. 5 years later, Massachusetts became the first state to abolish slavery in its constitution. 7 years after that, 1787, the U.S. Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, outlawing slavery in the Northwest Territories. Then in 1807, following on the Constitution, and 3 weeks before Britain ended the Atlantic slave trade, Thomas Jefferson signed a law prohibiting the importation of slaves into the United States, following from Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. As we all know, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all U.S. slaves in states that had seceded from the Union. And this was followed in 1865 by the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. Now, for our students, they tend to think, well, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, slavery in the world ended, right? Not the case. The last country to abolish slavery was Mauritania, and they did that in 1981, right? And sad to say, today, over 40 million people across the world are still trapped in modern forms of slavery, right? Well, even this just outline of the history of slavery should be enough to rebut the New York Times 1619 Project. No, slavery was not primarily an American phenomenon. It has existed worldwide. And no, America didn't invent slavery. That happened over 9,000 years ago. And then finally, slavery did not end in the world with the passage of the 13th Amendment. There continue to be 40 million slaves as we speak, right? Now, these historical facts are so easily accessed that you have to wonder why the Times and too many of our professors today seek to persuade us that a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is nevertheless, in fact, defined not by its world-transforming aspiration for human equality, but instead by the very slavery, the destruction of which required the Civil War and 600,000 American lives. Right? So far from ignoring or minimizing the history of slavery in this country, when we take a look at the full facts about the history of slavery worldwide, we understand both slavery in the United States as well as our successful efforts to end it. Right? Second piece that has come out recently on the American founding, also from the New York Times, carries the following title: "Think the Constitution will save us? Think again." Right? And the subhead of the New York Times piece conveys their thesis, which states, "The subversion of democracy was the explicit intent of the framers." New York Times. Right? Now, as evidence for their contention, they cite things such as, and Chuck mentioned this, the Electoral College, as well as the U.S. Senate, right? Both of which are based in part on statehood itself, because we are a nation of states, right? But these constitutional elements convince the New York Times that, quote, "The American government is structured by an 18th century text that is almost impossible to change," unquote. Right? And they tell us also constitutional amendments won't save us either. Why? Because the structure is almost impossible to change because, quote, "the Constitution intentionally prevents it." Right? So, the New York Times concludes, quote, "As long as we think of our Constitution as a sacred document, instead of an outdated relic, we'll have to deal with its anti-democratic consequences." Right? Now, to their credit, to advance their argument, the Times goes to where it should go. It goes to the Federalist Papers, right? The authoritative source on the meaning of our Constitution. And they go to the most famous Federalist essay, Federalist 10, written by James Madison. And they quote Madison in part. Madison writes, quote, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property." Okay? Reading that part of Federalist 10, the New York Times concludes that therefore Madison helped create a system in which the government rules over people rather than as an evolving tool of popular self-government, right? Unfortunately, the Times misses the true meaning of Madison's critique of quote-unquote democracy, right? But in saying that, this is not simply going after the New York Times, right? Because they're far from alone in this failure. Over 100 years ago, Charles Beard, 1913, wrote a book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And there Beard says, everything important about the Constitution has to be understood as rich white men trying to protect their property from the masses, right? Now, to his credit, Beard recanted most of his findings. And other scholars took care of the parts that he didn't recant. But that has not stopped the Academy from looking upon Beard's doctrine as gospel. And it continues to this day, right? But here's what they all miss. When Madison critiques democracy in Federalist 10, he's talking about what he calls a pure democracy, meaning where all the citizens assemble and deliberate and vote together, which of course is only possible in a small area, and this is how it was done in the ancient Greek city-states. Right? Now, how do I know that that's what Madison was talking about? Because unlike the Times, I read the other half of the paragraph, right? 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 Their half quote seeks to advance a half truth by ignoring what precedes it in that very same paragraph. Here's the whole quote. Madison says, "From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction." Right? That's why the founders sought to establish a large republic, because all the small republics in history have been torn apart. Right? It's only then that the Times half quote appears, it's only then that Madison says, hence it is that such pure democracies have been spectacles of turbulence and contention, right? Madison's not rejecting democracy, he's only rejecting pure democracy, right? He embraces instead the other species of popular government, a republic, right? A republic for Madison differs from a democracy in that the people rule through representatives. When Madison says republic in the Federalist Papers, he means a representative democracy, right? So then, with the true meaning of Madison's critique of democracy restored, I suspect that even the New York Times, on reviewing the atrocities committed under the pure democracies of antiquity, remember Socrates, what they do to him, right? Had to drink the hemlock, right? It was purely democratic. In fact, the Athenian juries consisted of 500, right? He got voted down 280 to 220, and he said, well, that's better than I thought I was going to do. Right? When you review the atrocities that people lived under in pure democracies, how can you not agree with Madison's statement that pure democracies, quote, have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention? Right? Well, even this thumbnail sketch of Federalist 10 is sufficient to suggest that the Constitution may in fact not be an outdated relic, right? At least a closer reading of the Federalist demonstrates that the Constitution is decidedly pro-democracy while decidedly anti-pure democracy, as history shows we should all be. Right? Third and last, we come to a piece that was penned by Vox a few July 4ths ago and was repeated almost verbatim in a piece that appeared this July 4th in Salon, namely that the Declaration of Independence is, to take from the title, racist, sexist, and prejudiced. Right? Both articles lament the fact that we celebrate the Constitution and that we celebrate Independence Day. Right? Why? According to them, quote, the main benefit of the revolution to colonists was that it gave more power to America's white male minority. while denying freedom for slaves and women and doing nothing to help Native Americans. Right? Well, to see the falsity of these claims, let's go back and read the thoughts of better informed minds throughout history, beginning with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech delivered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. King spoke these immortal words, quote, "When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," unquote. The Reverend King knew better than those at Vox and Salon and the New York Times why we celebrate the 4th of July and Constitution Day. When it comes to the 4th of July, in the first place, we do not celebrate the 4th of July because that's the day we declared independence from Great Britain, right? That was accomplished 2 days earlier on July 2nd through a simple act of the Continental Congress. We celebrate July 4th rather than July 2nd because the 4th is the day we adopted the Declaration of Independence. Right? And again, contrary to Vox and the New York Times, the Reverend King understood that the Declaration did not justify giving more power to the white minority. Right? It condemned it, providing us, future Americans, as King attested, providing us the moral compass by which to bring our practices better into line with our principles. Right? Vox's view that our Declaration justified war of independence aimed only to make the white male minority here equal to their brethren in the mother country of England, that itself was the position taken in what is perhaps the most infamous Supreme Court decision in history, and that's the 1857 decision, Dred Scott versus Sandford, right? In which Chief Justice Roger Taney, like the New York Times, woefully misread our founders' intentions. Taney's majority opinion states that under the Declaration and Constitution, blacks had, quote, "no rights which the white man was bound to respect," unquote. Right? Well, the Supreme Court had spoken, right? But it would be Lincoln who would have the last word. Right? The Dred Scott ruling drew him out of political retirement. Lincoln thought he was done with politics. It drew him out of retirement. It breathed new life into the new anti-slavery party, the GOP, of which he would become the first successful candidate for president in 1860. Now, in his June 1857 critique of the Dred Scott decision, Lincoln explained the conflict between the Declaration's foundational principles of human equality and the practice of slavery at the time, because this is the key question, right? The founders, said Lincoln, quote, "did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all men were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon," end quote. Instead, says Lincoln, the Declaration, quote, "was meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated." And Lincoln also adds that this assertion in the Declaration that all men are created equal, he said that was of no practical use in affecting our separation from Great Britain, right? Instead, he says it was placed in the Declaration not for then, but for what he calls, quote, "future use," right? Here, says Abraham Lincoln, is the deepest reason we celebrate the 4th of July and Constitution Day. And of course, the Reverend King would make history with his future use of the Declaration more than a century later. Now, a month prior to Lincoln's critique of the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the famed abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass delivered a magnificent speech on the Dred Scott decision in which he rejected Chief Justice Taney's and the New York Times' view that, quote, because the Constitution comes down to us from a slaveholding period and a slaveholding people, we are bound to suppose that blacks are forever debarred from all participation in the benefits of the Constitution and the Declaration, unquote. Instead, says Frederick Douglass, he says, just do a plain reading of the Declaration and Constitution, as we just did with Federalist 10 a few minutes ago. And he says, if you look at the Declaration and the Constitution, you will find that both documents, quote, include blacks in their beneficent range, unquote. Like Lincoln at the time, and like the Reverend King afterward, Frederick Douglass knew that the Declaration's principles included rather than excluded the black race, right? And the force of Douglass's appeal consisted in exhorting white Americans to live up to their principles. Right? Live up to their principles. But today, too many in the academy and the media believe that the only way we can achieve the ideal of human equality is to abandon our racist founding principles, right? Well, there was the famed Lincoln scholar, the late Harry Jaffa. He saw this coming back as far as 1959. Right? Conservatives have been trying to tell people about this for a while. And he says this in the introduction to his book, which is the best book ever written on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, best book ever written on Lincoln, and maybe the best book ever written on American political thought. It's called Crisis of the House Divided. I recommend it. In the introduction, Jaffa says this. He says that then, 1959, as today, universities have become, quote, the decisive source of the ruling opinions in our country, unquote. And on this basis, Jaffa predicted that, quote, the utopianism and intolerance taught in our universities then, as today, would surely spell the end of constitutional democracy, unquote. Okay? Jaffa was prescient in this regard because now we see the media, having been instructed in the universities as to the racism of the American founding, are now calling for things like the 1619 Project. Ideas have consequences. Right? Abraham Lincoln foresaw the disastrous consequences that would follow our failure to teach our young people our fundamental principles of justice. Right? Now, I began my talk by mentioning the speech that Lincoln gave at the age of 29 to the Young Men's Lyceum, in which Lincoln saw disregard for the Declaration and Constitution already growing as a result of the dying out of the founding generation. Right? It happens. The founding generation, they fought for their freedom. The love of liberty is strong in them, but generation comes after, further away from the struggle. They're a little more comfortable. It's human nature, right? Lincoln said that the only antidote to such degeneration was to, quote, teach reverence for the Constitution in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. Right? That's civic education. Right? That's a country that has civic virtue. Right? We've fallen so far from Lincoln's prescription today that his admonition would appear to some people as just laughable. Right? But think about it. Right? Who can doubt Lincoln's premise that a self-governing people can maintain its liberty only so long as its citizens practice reverence for the principles that justify their liberty, right? You can't defend what you can't understand, right? And who can doubt Lincoln, Douglas, and Martin Luther King's demonstrations that the foundation of those principles is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? But if we don't restore civics education, our students will never know these arguments, right? How many college students today even know who Frederick Douglass was, right? How many students have read the Lincoln-Douglas debates or even one of them? Not their fault, right? It's not their fault. If we don't restore civics education, they'll never know these arguments, they'll never know these rebuttals to the claims of the New York Times, in which case, if that happens, we can expect only more civic illiteracy and the democratic degeneration that we have been suffering from recently. Right? Now, let me close with a few more details on our current decline in civic knowledge. And believe it or not, I saved the worst for last. Right? A new national study finds that most native-born Americans would fail the U.S. citizenship test. Right? The Wilson National Fellowship Foundation gave native-born Americans multiple choice questions based on the U.S. CIS citizenship test. Right? Now, let me tell you a little about this test. Right? It's only 10 questions. They're multiple choice. All 100 possible questions are on a database with answers that you can consult. You only have to get 6 out of 10 to pass. Now, the good news is 91% of immigrants pass the test. But only 36% of native-born Americans can even get 6 out of 10 right. Right? And the study also reveals an age gap in civic literacy, and this speaks to the failure of our educational system, right? Fully 74% of senior citizens can pass and did pass the citizenship test. What does that mean? That means that only 20% of native-born Americans under the age of 45 can even get 6 out of 10 right. Right? Yeah. It tells us, again, I don't blame those under 45 who can't pass the test. I blame those of us who are supposed to be acting like adults and teaching them. Right? Right? It has been said that the philosophy taught in the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy practiced in the legislature in the next generation. Right? If that's the case, and I believe it is, then this precipitous decline in civics education is nothing less than terrifying. Thomas Jefferson warned us that, quote, "No nation can expect to be both ignorant and free," unquote, right? We expect immigrants in this country to pass the citizenship test in order to become citizens, and rightly so. And yet 4 out of 5 Americans under the age of 45 can't pass it. Right? What can be done is the question. Here in Texas, in the last legislative session just concluded, we supported a bill that was signed by the governor, we're happy to say, and it will require embedding 10 questions from the U.S. citizenship test into the junior year U.S. history STAR end of course exam. Right? The new law that we supported also requires that the students' aggregate results on each question be posted online for parents to inspect, right? We hope to have the first results of this diagnostic tool by the 2021 legislative session, at which time we will have the answer, are Texas students doing any better than the 20% pass rate of their peers in the other 49 states? We certainly hope so, right? But if not, we'll then have the data to justify our call for a restoration of the founding documents as the required central element of a genuine civics education that would be required of all students regardless of major. Right? If we're successful, and I hope I've demonstrated we have to be successful, if we're successful in restoring civics education, If we take seriously Lincoln's admonition, in doing so, we will come again to understand why the Declaration and the Constitution have been looked to by nations across the globe as both an inspiration and as a model for their own form of government. We would come again to understand why Lincoln declared the nation built on the Declaration's principles to be, quote, the last best hope of earth, unquote. We would then come again to understand why the future of America depends on properly celebrating both Constitution Day and the 4th of July. Thank you.
All right, now is your chance to ask some questions of Dr. Lindsay. We're looking forward to having some dialogue. We'll just start at this end and work our way over. And if you didn't think to raise your hand initially over here, we'll come back to you. So in the back row, yes. And also, please wait for a microphone to come to you.
Thank you for coming. Therese Fair. If we restore civics to high schools, what will guarantee that the teachers will properly teach it?
Yeah. Short answer to that, nothing. Nothing guarantees it. I mean, look, we're in a battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. The teachers that I worked with this past summer in our Summer Institute, wonderful people, wonderful people. And that's what I meant when I said that what I heard from that teacher about the state of children coming in middle school age, already cynical about America, how that changed my thinking. They didn't hear that from their teacher. They told it to their teacher, middle school kids. So where are they getting it? I'll just give you one example because it's the culture is the answer, right? I haven't seen the film, but my kids have told me that there was a Spider-Man film 2 or 3 years ago in which Peter Parker, right, Spider-Man, and his class go on a field trip to Washington, D.C. They're standing outside the Washington Monument, about to go in, when the woman who is with Peter Parker says, well, I'm not going to go in there. And he says, why not? And she says, well, I'm not going to go in a building that was built by slaves. And when she says that, Peter looks at the guard who's standing at the door, and the guard says, it's not true, right? Now think about that for a second. Why in some silly superhero comic book film, right? Why would they do that? Was that just a blip? Wasn't a blip. Most kids are going to learn more or think they learn more from movies and TV and media than they're going to pay attention to us in the classrooms, right? That's the depth of our problem. So can we make the teachers do it? No, we can't. All we can do is hope that the truth has a power of its own, right?
Well, along the same lines, Tom, has the citizenship test questions, have they already been affected by these sorts of trends? In other words, yeah. I know you can access the questions online. I haven't done it. I just haven't done it. But isn't it plausible to assume that at some point the people who came up with the 1619 project will also be in charge of coming up with the questions on the citizenship test?
It is absolutely right to assume that and to fear it. Again, all we can do, and this is why, in addition to trying to get legislation passed here, that we've started our own institute for teaching civics, right? It's time to educate the educators, right? So that's why we're doing that. I have no more faith in the system than you do, but the system's made of people. And if we can get to people one-on-one, because look, I mean, just as I said, these thumbnail sketches of Federalist 10, the Declaration, you can see the lies, right? It's not that hard, but our students aren't getting it, right? The core of our democratic faith is that the people are sufficiently wise that if they're informed of the alternatives in a free and open debate, they'll choose wisely. Right? We're just trying to restore that possibility.
Right here.
There are some of us who would like to see another constitutional convention. Primarily, a key issue, in my view, would be like term limits. And there are now several states that have voted for one. Am I kind of barking up the wrong tree? Will a constitutional convention, based on what you just said, if in fact it could ever happen, do more harm than good?
I am not as worried. Well, I would be worried if we had another constitutional convention. But what these states have called for is instead an amending convention. Here's the difference. The Constitution provides two ways for amendments. It can come from Congress, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, or 38 states, or it can come from 34 states, 2/3, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Never in our history have any amendments come up from the states. The movement that you're talking about, therefore, is different from that. And, Justice Scalia was asked about this, and here's what he said. He said, I don't really care what the content is of any amendment that comes from a state's amendment convention. He said, now, I'm not saying I'm in favor of silly amendments, but what he said was this. He says, if the states, for the first time in their history, you get 38 of them to agree, to propose, as you said, your term limits, he said, you watch the Supreme Court and Congress sit up and take notice, right? Because we've never exercised that power in our history, right? George Mason, we can thank for that. He was the one who said, they were all set to just say, yeah, we'll have amendments, Congress will introduce them, states 3/4. George Mason said, wait a second here. You're telling me that Congress is going to propose amendments to reduce the power that Congress itself has taken? Right? That's why we have the other method. I would love to see that happen. TPPF has supported what's called an Article 5 convention for a number of years.
I'm a huge fan of Hillsdale College's Constitution 101 courses and so on. What would be the possibility of getting that to our individual states' Board of Education, getting that to become a part of the curricula required both at the middle school level and upward through high school with a second course? I think that would go a long way. And I think it probably ought to be presented to the civics teachers first, and then presented to the teachers.
Yeah.
What about it?
Yeah, I've looked at Hillsdale's site. I look at it frequently, and it's wonderful. Little chance at this point of getting the state of Texas to adopt, or any state for that matter, but that doesn't mean that individuals such as we've been doing here. As I say, we've got to start teaching our kids ourselves. We can't depend on the school system anymore, right?
My son recently went off to college to University of Florida. And at first I was a little apprehensive until I learned that all incoming freshmen to that university have to pass the civics exam as an entrance requirement. And I thought, what a great idea. Why don't we do that in Texas?
Yeah. Well, we almost did. We almost did a form of that. And Florida has been very good on this. You're right about that. Well, in fact, 27 states have either passed or introduced legislation dealing with the civic education problem, right? In fact, there was a bill here in the Texas legislature in 2017. It passed the House, didn't go to the Senate. It would have replaced the U.S. History junior year STAR end of course exam, right, with the U.S. citizenship test. Now, we here completely agreed with the sentiments behind that, but here's the problem. and thanks to the transparency we have here in Texas, you can go online and you can look at all the questions the students study. The junior year U.S. history test is much more rigorous than the citizenship test, right? So replacing it with that would have been going from bad to worse. Yeah.
Thank you for today. I learned quite a bit. I've got some interesting things that you've shared that I can learn from. I wanted to share that I belong to a women's organization, and all of us have the opportunity to make a small dent in the education system that we're around. We raise money, and every year on Constitution Day, we get approval from certain schools, and we go into the 5th grade, and we're able to do a presentation and give them their own Constitution and a U.S. flag. So that's how we started the day this morning. We did it across Texas. And so if you're in an environment where you could make that change in your school system, try to do that.
Yes, and God bless you for doing that, because that's exactly the type of individual action, right, that we need to take, right? In addition to going to school board meetings. I know, but, right, that's where the sausage gets made, right? In addition, when your alma mater calls you for a donation, you say, okay, but first answer 2 questions. Right? Does your campus protect free speech? Right? And then second, do you require study of the founding documents? And when they say no and no, you can say, get back to me when you do.
Any other questions? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I have a question about the textbooks that are used in the high school U.S. history. And I understand another textbook has been written by a McClay, if I think is that his name. It kind of essentially, I believe, refuting what Howard Zinn has been preaching to the choir for years. And I know my 3 girls have gone through the Howard Zinn books. And we have, there's some things we just don't talk about at home now because we want to preserve the peace in the family. But what is the likelihood of getting more of people like McClay and others to write books, you know, on a positive side of the U.S. history story?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Wilfred McClay, professor of history, an excellent scholar, has written a book that's a critique of Howard Zinn's People's Democracy. A People's History of the United States is the full title. Even the Organization of American Historians, okay, and history professors are far from a conservative bunch, to put it right. Even they say that Zinn's book is trash, right? What's that?
Then why is it used?
Yeah, well, why are Charles Beard's findings from 1913, which he himself recanted? I mean, folks, we're in a war, right? We're in a war. I mean, as you saw from those presentations in the media, they're not fighting fair when you're not even quoting the other half of the paragraph. Really? I mean, when this passes in the New York Times, yeah, so, you know, without trying to sound apocalyptic, I do want to communicate to you the intensity and the ferocity of the project that goes under various names, one of which is the 1619 Project, right? The idea is to make Americans so heavily laden with guilt that they no longer feel justified in defending their way of life. You do that and you win without ever firing a shot.
There's also a Howard Zinn nonprofit foundation which spends millions of dollars annually to place the textbooks and the modern interpretations of them into our classroom. So they're out there providing free books and curricula for teachers to promote the memory and philosophy of Howard Zinn.
That's a great point. It's called the Zinn Education Project, right? Now, someone told me that over 2 million copies of Zinn's book are in high schools around the country. Right? Even Mitch Daniels, president of Purdue, the best college president in America today, he has succeeded in every reform he tried to push through, except when he criticized the Zinn book, and they descended on him. Right? Now, let me tell you one last thing. This is just how deep it is. Does everybody remember 2008 election campaign between John McCain and Barack Obama, in which there appeared a picture of William Ayers giving a speech, and then they tied him to Obama? William Ayers was, in the 60s, part of the Weathermen, right? A terrorist. He got off on a fluke, a technicality. He walked out of court and said, "Free as a bird, what a country," right? After all that national commotion, the American Education Research Association, which tells teachers what textbooks are good textbooks, they made William Ayers vice president of research.
And his wife is also teaching at Northwestern, our alma mater. So when they call, de nada.
Good for you. Good for you.
So we have a question up front.
You know, Doctor, you mentioned about, you know, this whole media business with Spider-Man, and I think we all, when you watch the news, and a lot of the news organizations, you know, they're certainly biased in the news, and I think they're trying to manipulate the news in the favor of liberals and progressives, and of course, a lot of people get their news from social media, TV, and it's almost a mob mentality, and because if you were a moderate on CNN, they'd probably kick you off the island, right? I mean,
yeah.
So you get this mob mentality, and I just think it's going to be a difficult thing to overcome. And I kind of wonder, what are they? Since you've been involved in college, what do they teach in journalism at these colleges? I'm serious. I mean,
yeah.
I look at these journalists. The New York Times just mentioned 2 days ago they distorted a whole thing on Kavanaugh. I think everybody's seen it. They're not going to stop until they get to their objective. And I'm thinking to myself, what are they teaching these journalists in college to be fair?
Yeah. Well, first thing, no genuine college should have a major in journalism. First point, right? You want to be a political journalist, study political science. Study, just the same thing as teaching, just as there should be no education schools, right? Study the subject, right? And, I mean, look, is there any journalism left today? Not much. Not much.
But I'm saying that, you know, young people sort of, you know, we're kind of old and cynical, right? And we're kind of more cynical, and we can separate the facts from the fiction. Where I think, you know, younger people, they get this, and I mean, I've seen it with my kids, and oh yeah, did you see this happen? Well, it didn't really happen, right? It was fake news, but they get it in their brains, and they don't do the read on time and things like that. And I think sometimes it starts with these journalists and integrity with these journalists to report both sides of an issue, and then you make your decision.
It goes beyond the education. It goes to the self-selection of the type of people who are interested in that in the first place. Right. So back in my collegiate career in the early 80s, for about a year, I was studying journalism before I earned an Army scholarship and went to a different college. And I discovered that out of all the students and professors, I was the only conservative in the program. And I thought, this is going to be career limiting for me, that if I take this as a career path, I'm going to be, you know, the outcast. And on the other hand, when I joined the ROTC program, I found that the vast majority of fellow officer candidates had a similar view of the Constitution and of the value of America, et cetera. And so I think that's kind of explains right away. People go into what they're interested in. And so I don't necessarily think it's the type of education, it's just the type of people who are drawn to that profession. And that's probably why a very small percentage of Americans now trust journalism. In the back.
I'll just add to that.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I went to University of Missouri Columbia School of Journalism in the 70s, the second half of the 70s. And, you know, I went in with the idea that I was going to be a journalist. By the time I got through the first year of classes, it's a 2-year course of study, I knew I was not going to be a journalist because they weren't teaching what I perceived as journalism. They were teaching advocacy journalism, which basically meant to advocate for your point of view,
Right.
as long as it was left, not right.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that came straight from the editors. Yeah, I'd say so, and it hasn't stopped since. That was 1977 through 79. You know, it's not going to go away.
No, it's not going to go away, but again, encouraging for us in our core democratic faith and the discernment of the people, they've overshot, right? I mean, right, people don't believe them anymore, right? They don't believe them.
Thank you, President Trump.
Yeah, that's probably why he got elected, right?
All right, any other questions? Well, very good. I think we are coming to the end of our event. Tom, do you want to tell them about, wrap up and tell them about what's waiting for them out in the lobby?
You have wonderful food waiting for you in the lobby.
Well, and the Constitutions.
And the Constitutions, don't eat those. But yes.
Chick-fil-A and Constitutions.
There you go.
What a country.
Thank you all for coming.
Good job.